Starting off at number 5, burning at the stake. By far the most well-known punishment for those tried as witches, burning at the stake was a cruel and unusual form of execution used commonly back during the many witch trials of the 17th century. These executions were not only physically agonizing, but also symbolized the depths of human fear and prejudice. One such example of this terrible practice was the Würzburg witch trials of the 17th century, known as one of the largest witch trials in history. Accused witches faced a horrifying fate at the stake. The authorities believed that fire possessed the purifying power to cleanse the accused of their alleged connections to the devil. In reality, it was a grotesque display of violence. Victims were often tied to wooden stakes in a public square, surrounded by jeering crowds. They were subjected to unimaginable pain as the flames slowly consumed them. The agony of being burnt alive was drawn out, excruciating, and inhumane. What made the burning of witches particularly cruel was the complete absence of credible evidence. The trials were fueled by paranoia, superstition, and hysteria. Accusations were often based on flimsy hearsay, personal grudges, or even just random suspicions. The accused had little chance to defend themselves, and confessions were often extracted through rigorous mental and physical torment. These false confessions only added to the tragedy, as innocent people were forced to implicate themselves and others in a desperate attempt to end their suffering. Furthermore, the persecution of witches during the Würzburg witch trials, like many other witch hunts, was often intertwined with gender bias. Women, especially those who didn't conform to societal norms, were disproportionately targeted. Accusations of witchcraft could be used to control and punish women who challenged the status quo or were perceived as a threat to male authority. The cruelty of burning witches at the stake was not limited to the physical torment. It was a gruesome spectacle intended to terrify the populace into submission. Public executions were meant to send a message that dissent would not be tolerated and that conformity to prevailing religious and social norms was imperative. The psychological impact on society was profound, as fear and mistrust tore communities apart. The Würzburg witch trials, like many others, were eventually recognized as a dark chapter in history. They serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of mass hysteria, religious fanaticism, and the absence of due process. Today, we look back on these events with horror and regret, vowing never to repeat the cruelty of burning alleged witches at the stake. It is a somber lesson that underscores the importance of justice, reason, and compassion in our pursuit of a more enlightened society. Next up at number 4, witch cakes. Witch cakes are a bizarre and unsettling aspect of the witch trials that swept through colonial America during the 17th century, as exemplified in the infamous case of Tituba. These cakes, concocted from peculiar ingredients, were believed to possess the power to reveal the presence of witches. While they may seem like a bizarre footnote in history, witch cakes serve as a chilling reminder of the hysteria and irrationality that fueled the witch trials. In the case of Tituba, a slave woman living in Salem, Massachusetts, witch cakes played a central role in her ordeal. Tituba was accused of practicing witchcraft, and her accuser sought a means to expose her supposed demonic affiliations. They decided to bake a witch cake, a crude mixture of rye meal and the urine of the afflicted girls who claimed to be victims of witchcraft. Ew. The logic behind these cakes was deeply flawed and rooted in superstition. It was believed that by feeding the cake to a dog, the dog would act as a conduit, causing the witch to experience pain and reveal their true nature. This bizarre form of witch detection demonstrates the length of which fear and paranoia can drive people to concoct irrational and cruel methods of persecution. Tituba was subjected to this ordeal, and when the dog exhibited unusual behavior, because it was eating urine, it was seen as evidence of her guilt. This marked the beginning of her traumatic journey through the Salem witch trials, which ultimately led to her confession under duress. The use of witch cakes underscores the hysteria and desperation that characterized the witch trials. Accusers and authorities were willing to resort to absurd and unscientific methods to justify their persecution of those they believed to be witches. These methods were not only illogical, but also cruel, as they subjected the accused to public humiliation, physical examinations, and often torment. Number 3, dunking. Dunking was a cruel and unusual punishment employed during the witch trials that swept through Europe and its colonies in the 16th and 17th centuries, including Northamptonshire, England. This brutal practice, also known as ducking or swimming, was intended to determine an individual's guilt or innocence of witchcraft, but it often resulted in severe physical and psychological suffering. In Northamptonshire and other regions, dunking involved binding the accused witch, often a woman, and lowering her into a body of water, typically a river or pond. The rationale behind this test was rooted in superstition and flawed logic. It was believed that because witches had renounced their baptism, the pure element of water would reject them, causing them to float. If the accused floated, they were seen as guilty of witchcraft. If they sank, they were deemed innocent, but often drowned in the process. Being forcibly dunked into cold water while bound was a terrifying and painful experience. The accused would struggle for air and face the risk of drowning, all while the onlookers watched in morbid anticipation. Dunking was an arbitrary and irrational method of determining guilt. The outcome depended on various factors, such as the accused body's composition and the skill of the dunking implementers. Innocent people could easily be declared guilty, leading to wrongful executions. Despite its cruelty and lack of reliability, dunking persisted in witch trials because it was consistent with the prevailing belief in the supernatural and the desire for swift justice. It was only with the eventual decline of witch hunts and the advent of more rational legal systems that such inhumane practices were abandoned.
Number 2 on this list is called pricking. This was a horrible test that was basically just a glorified means of torture. Now I'm sure that most of you know what a witch mark is, but if you don't, then it's basically a mark from the devil that indicates you have a pact with Satan, and witches have these on their bodies. However, if there's an accused witch that doesn't have a witch mark, that doesn't mean that they're off the hook. It's possible that they still have a witch mark. It's just hard to see, or it can't be seen to the naked eye. Well, if this was the case, then you need a professional pricker, right? A professional pricker is someone who works solely on discovering witches' marks. That's right, guys, this was so common that they actually had a career path that came out of it. It was believed that a witch's mark didn't feel any pain and in turn wouldn't show any signs of weaknesses. Therefore, if you pricked them with a sharp point, then the person wouldn't be in any pain and no blood would come from this prick. So professional prickers would have their accused witches and they would just take their chosen sharp object and just stab them until you had a spot that didn't bleed. And then, because you didn't bleed, they would kill you for being a witch anyways. It also didn't stop at just pricking, but it even went to scratching as well. The victim of an apparent witch would be allowed to come and scratch that witch until they drew blood. This was supposed to cause the victim some relief from their symptoms, and if it did, then that would be enough to make the accused person guilty of witchcraft and they would be executed. Yeah, you really did not want to get stuck with the pricking test.
And at number 1, crushing. In the annals of history, the Salem witch trials of 1692 stand as a stark testament to humanity's capacity for cruelty, particularly in the realm of legal punishment. Amid the hysteria that gripped colonial Massachusetts, a plethora of cruel and unusual methods were employed to elicit confessions from the accused witches. Among these harrowing practices, the use of pressing or crushing remains one of the most chilling. The process of pressing was as brutal as it was inhumane. The accused individual would be stripped of all dignity and laid down in a dark, dank cell. Heavy stones or wooden boards, laden with an unimaginable weight, would then be stacked upon their chest. The agony that followed was beyond words. As the relentless pressure bore down, every grasp for breath became a desperate struggle. The rationale behind this method was chillingly simplistic. Those who confessed to their alleged dealings with the devil could halt the pressing, while those who resisted would face an excruciating demise. The authorities, consumed by fear and paranoia, believed that witches, having supposedly consorted with Satan, possessed a supernatural resilience that rendered them impervious to such torment. The cruelty of pressing was evident not only in its physical brutality, but also in its stark absence of due process. Accused witches had no chance to defend themselves, no legal representation, and no recourse to justice. Their fates rested in the hands of accusers and a court swayed by mass hysteria and irrational beliefs. Perhaps the most infamous case of pressing during the Salem witch trials was that of Giles Corey. A resilient and principled man, Corey refused to enter a plea, knowing that doing so would lead to the forfeiture of his property. His stoic resistance, in the face of a slow and agonizing death, made him a symbol of defiance against the unjust trials.
In 5th place, we have witch cakes to kick us off. Sadly, these aren't yummy Halloween cakes, a thought which makes me very hungry, but instead a bizarre form of countermagic, a supernatural dessert used to identify suspected evildoers. In cases of mysterious illness or possession, witch hunters would take a sample of the victim's urine, mix it with rye meal and ashes, and bake it into a cake. This stomach-turning concoction was then fed to a familiar or animal helper of the suspected witch in the hopes that the creature would fall under its spell and reveal the name of the guilty sorcerer. During the hysteria that preceded the Salem witch trials, Tituba famously helped prepare a witch cake to identify the person responsible for bewitching young Betty Paris and others. The brew failed to work, and Tituba's knowledge of spells and folk remedies was later used as evidence against her when she was accused of being a witch. Before I forget, another use for a witch cake came from burning the pastry in hopes that the scorching heat would transfer to the witch and force her to reveal herself. Whew. Anybody else starting to get warm? Oh great, just me. In fourth place, we have a Scold bridle. Also known as a witch's bridle, a gossip's bridle, a Brink's bridle, or simply Brinks, this was an instrument of punishment as a form of public humiliation. This thing was an iron muzzle and an iron framework that enclosed the head. Some exceptions were masks that depicted suffering, but not pleasant either way. My brain just jumped to a similar modern device used for pleasure instead of pain, and no, I will not elaborate on that thought, but let's clarify. A bridle bit, or curb plate, around 5 centimeters by 2.5 centimeters in size, was slid into the mouth and pressed down on top of the tongue, often with a spike on the tongue as a compress. It functioned to silence the wearer from speaking entirely, and caused extreme pain and physiological trauma to scare and intimidate the wearer into submission. This prevented speaking and resulted in many unpleasant side effects for the wearer, including excessive salivation and fatigue in the mouth. Seeing as I've always been a chatty Cathy, I can totally see how I would have been sentenced to this, and my jaw hurts just thinking about it. The wearer was then led around the town by a leash, and for extra humiliation, a bell could also be attached to draw in crowds. First recorded in Scotland in 1567, the Brinks were also used in England and its colonies. The Kirk Sessions and barony courts in Scotland inflicted the contraption mostly on female transgressors, and women considered to be rude, nags, common scolds, drunken, but mostly witches. It was also used as corporal punishment for other offenses, notably on female workhouse inmates. The person to be punished was placed in a public place for additional humiliation and sometimes beaten. Just sometimes, not every time apparently. Knowing what I know about history and cover-ups, I'm going to lean towards probably most of the time. The Lanarkburg records record a typical example of the punishment being used. When wearing the device, it was, impossible for the person to either eat or speak. Other pranks included an adjustable gag with a sharp edge, causing any movement of the mouth to result in laceration of the tongue. In Scotland, pranks could also be permanently displayed in public by attaching them, for example, to the town cross, tron, or toll booth. Then the ritual humiliation would take place, with the miscreant on public display. Displaying the pranks in public was intended to remind the populace of the consequences of any rash action or slander. Whether the person was paraded or simply taken to the point of punishment, the process of humiliation and expected repentance was the same. Time spent in the bridle was normally allocated by the Kirk Session in Scotland or by a local magistrate. Number 3, tunnels under the graveyard. Honest to goodness, the moment I heard about this as a possibility, my modern brain started to think about all the ways this could be convenient today. Also, being a Disney girl, my brain did jump to the utilidor system that runs under Disney World. Ooh, and the Toronto Path. Granted, I never really use it unless my dad's visiting and we're like walking around downtown, or if I'm trying to get to Union Station after a convention downtown. Pardon me, I know, off topic. So this legend claims that underneath the old Bearing Point Cemetery is a series of tunnels that used to be connected to the Salem harbor. Used for smuggling or simply unloading ships, these tunnels would flood with the high tide. When digging graves, workers would simply open up shafts to these tunnels, and as the priest would ask the mourners to look up to the heavens, they would unceremoniously dump the bodies down these shafts to be washed out to sea. It sounds a smidge morbid and hard to believe, but that's the joy of legends. But here's the thing, it actually has like the tiniest glimmer of truth, like the tiniest, most minuscule flicker. Smaller than Tinkerbell. Originally, the Salem harbor did come close to what is currently the cemetery, until sections of the city were filled in, and there are some tunnels underneath Salem. However, the rest is such complete and utter ridiculousness that historians are adamant it isn't true. But there's only one way to find out. Who wants to go on a road trip to Salem with me to go tunnel hunting? My car has room for plenty of people, trust me. In second place, we have witch mark hunting and pricking. Witch hunters often had their suspects stripped and publicly examined for signs of an unsightly blemish that witches were said to receive upon making their pact with Satan. This devil's mark could supposedly change shape and color and was believed to be numb and insensitive to pain. Prosecutors might also search for the witch's teat, which was an extra nipple allegedly used to suckle the witch's helper animals. In both cases, it was really easy for even the most minor physical imperfections to be labeled as the work of the devil himself. Oh my, the horror. Moles, scars, birthmarks, sores, and tattoos could all qualify, so examiners rarely came up empty-handed. I'm trying to think of just how many birthmarks I have all over my body, so just add that to the tally of how I'm, a witch. Seriously, I feel the burning from the flames already. In the midst of witch hunts, desperate villagers would sometimes even burn or cut off any offending marks on their bodies, only to have their wounds labeled as proof of a covenant with the devil. So, damned if you do, damned if you don't. If I'm adding like scars to my blemish count, Yeah, forget it. Okay, I think the temperature in here just went up another couple of degrees. Seriously. If witch hunters struggle to find obvious evidence of witches' marks on a suspect's body, they might resort to the ghastly practice of pricking as a means of, sussing it out. Come on! Even having a flawless body isn't going to exonerate you? What the heck? Witch hunting books and instructional pamphlets noted that the marks were insensitive to pain and couldn't bleed, so examiners used specially designed needles to repeatedly stab and prick at the accused person's flesh until they discovered a spot that produced the desired results. In England and Scotland, the punishment was eventually performed by well-paid professional prickers, many of whom were actually con men who used dull needle points to identify fake witches' marks. Well then, if you ever feel like your job just, isn't real, remember that people in history were paid to do well. Along with pricking, the unfortunate suspect might also be subjected to scratching by their supposed victims. This test was based on the notion that possessed people found relief by scratching the person responsible with their fingernails until they drew fluid. If their symptoms improved after clawing at the accused's skin, it was seen as partial evidence of guilt. No, absolutely not. I can't see anyone being proven innocent whatsoever from this nonsense. Talk about a biased court. In first place, we have dismemberment and mutilation. This is where my own stomach gets all topsy-turvy, so fair warning, I can handle creepy stuff, no problem. But gore? There's a reason I haven't been able to bring myself to watch the Terrifier movies. So when witch hunters wanted to get answers back in the day, if I haven't made it clear enough by now, they didn't really care about being humane or, coercion, just being right. They would do whatever they deemed necessary to get a confession, leading many witches to confess just to make the pain stop and end their lives, humanely. Say goodbye to your fingernails, because that was practically just a footnote in what they were allowed to do. While Perna Hosman of Bavaria was led through multiple different stages of mutilation while being paraded to her execution. At the first stop, her left breast and right arm were branded with irons, then her right breast at the second stop, her left arm at the third, with her left hand being then branded at the fourth stop. Once they reached the place of execution, her right hand, with which she had made her oath as a midwife, was cut off before she was finally burned alive at the stake. Oh, her ashes were not allowed to remain on soil, but they were just, dumped in a stream. Probably the most extreme extent of this was a punishment normally reserved for killers, but exceptions were made for witches who confessed without torture to crimes deemed brutal enough for it. Are y'all ready for this? The offender would be strapped to 4 horses, with one arm or leg attached to each separate horse, and then on command, the horses would start running and rip the offender's arms and legs off. The person would die somehow, and painfully through life source and limb loss.
Number 5 on this list is the prayer test. This test basically acts as the single most important audition of your life. It was thought that witches were unable to recite the word of God, and that reading or speaking the Bible would cause their immediate demise. Therefore, they would have accused witches come to the front of the court or gathering and recite verses from the Bible. Now, this test makes a decent amount of sense if you think about it, although we can't forget what era we were in when this took place. Not everyone was literate at this time. In fact, a lot of them weren't. I can also imagine the immense pressure that you would feel to perform that verse to perfection. Speaking as somebody who's been through their fair share of auditions in life, I can tell you that auditions are nerve-wracking to begin with, but add on the fact that your life is on the line, that really raises the stakes, I think. And it wasn't enough to have you simply not go up in flames as you were reading it. A simple slip-up, a mispronunciation, a little pause, all of these things were evidence that the accused was a witch and was struggling to get through the verse. The crazy thing about this as well is that even if you did recite this verse flawlessly without fail, you might still be put to death anyways. George Burroughs had to perform this test during the Salem trials, and even after he absolutely nailed it, they still killed him. The people were so convinced that he was a witch who needed to die that they chalked up his performance as being a devilish trick and killed him regardless. Number 4 on this list is witch cakes. Witch cakes are pretty unique in how they were administered because your fate wasn't decided by a person or the cake itself. It was actually by a dog. Now, I feel for these pups because they had to eat these concoctions and they aren't palatable at all. What people would do is take a sample of the victim's urine, so the person presumably being affected by the witch, take a sample of their urine, and then they take some rye meal and a sprinkle of ashes, and that's it. Take those 3 things, mix them together, toss them in the oven, and then bake it up. Now, I don't really know where they got the idea that urine and ashes would tell us anything about these witches, but that's the conclusion that they got. They then take the dog, and it was thought that dogs were not only man's best friend, but actually witches' best friends as well. That dogs back in the day had some sort of tie to witches, and that they were supporters of witches. So you take this witch cake, you feed it to the dog, and now you just observe that dog's behavior, and the accused witch has to just cross their fingers that this dog doesn't start acting weirdly, biting, barking at nothing, just generally acting strangely. It was thought that if the dog did this or exhibited any of the same symptoms that the victim was experiencing, then witchcraft was assuredly at foot, and then we can start pointing fingers. I gotta say though that I seriously feel for the dog in this instance, because I mean the poor guy did literally nothing at all, and now he's gotta eat this urine cake that may or may not curse him with something. So yeah, the dog's got it rough here, guys. Number 3 on this list is called the touch test. Witches were said to have the ability to control other people. Basically, they could cast a spell on you and you're now either under their control or in a lot of pain. If these witches were to touch the person who's believed to be under their curse or spell though, then that individual would have some type of response. Let's say someone who's controlled by these witches starts acting strange or frantic. Then a simple touch by the witch would calm them completely. I'm not really sure if this theory on witches and touching their victims has been founded by anything or is true to this day, but back then they definitely believed that this was the case. The problem with this test though was that there was a lot of wannabe actors back then. In 1662, there were 2 older women who were being accused of witchcraft. Their names were Amy Denny and Rose Cullender. Now, they had reportedly cursed some young girls and were causing them serious harm, which manifested itself in the way of seizures. These girls would have seizures, but it was believed that if the witch who was possessing them, so Amy and Rose, were to touch them, then the seizure would stop immediately. Well, sure enough, this was tested in court, and it actually worked. The second that the old women touched these girls, the seizures stopped immediately and their hands just grew completely soft and totally calm. But let's not kill them just yet. They then blindfolded the young girls and did the exact same experiment, but now with other people subbing in and touching them. Well, it turns out the girls were faking and would stop seizuring to other people who touched them instead of just the older women. Perfect. So Amy and Rose, they can't possibly be witches then. We ran the test, they passed, they should be set free. Maybe in today's world that's what would happen, but not in 1662. Both of them were hung anyways, and the young girls got off scot-free.
At number 2, prayer tests. Prayer tests stand as the greatest example of the unjust nature of the witch trials and the persecution of innocent individuals, making it a cruel punishment for anyone put on trial. They were a controversial and often absurd method used during the witch trials to supposedly rule out witches. These tests were grounded in superstition and religious fervor rather than sound evidence. 2 notable cases, those of Jane Wenham and George Burroughs, shed light on the use and cruel consequences of such prayer tests during witch trials. Jane Wenham's case is one of the last witch trials in England, occurring in 1712. She was accused of witchcraft in Hertfordshire, and her trial attracted considerable attention due to the changing climate of skepticism regarding witch trials. One of the methods employed to test her guilt or innocence was the prayer test. In Wenham's trial, the prayer test involved having the accused recite the Lord's Prayer without error, usually out of the Bible or other holy texts. It was believed that a witch would be unable to utter the prayer correctly due to their alleged unholy nature. However, this test was deeply flawed and arbitrary, as it ignored the fact that many accused witches were uneducated and might struggle with reading the Lord's Prayer, especially in the intense and stressful environment of a trial. She also underwent dunking in order to test her witchy nature. Fortunately, Jane Wenham was found not guilty, thanks to the rising skepticism surrounding witchcraft. Even when accused of flying, the judge would retort, "Is flying a crime?" Which it isn't. Her case is often cited as a turning point in England's witch trials, as it exposed the irrationality and injustice of such proceedings. But in the case of George Burroughs in 1692, he wasn't so lucky. George Burroughs was one of the individuals accused and executed during the Salem witch trials in colonial Massachusetts. His case highlights how the prayer test was used in the American context. In Burroughs' trial, the authorities used the Lord's Prayer as a test of his innocence. They believed that if he couldn't recite it correctly, he must be a witch. Burroughs, to the astonishment of many, recited the prayer flawlessly, challenging the validity of the test. However, the court, fueled by hysteria and prejudice, dismissed this as a trick of the devil. So much for testing him, right? George Burroughs was ultimately convicted and hanged, illustrating how even when an accused individual passed the prayer test, it did not guarantee their acquittal or protection from the witch hunt's irrationality. So yeah, if you were wanted dead back then, you would be made dead.
Number 1 on this list is the swimming test. Now this is one that I'm sure most of you have already heard about, but it has to be on this list based on just simply how ridiculous it was. Now even though in hindsight this test was nuts, I do kind of understand the logic of how they got there in the first place. It was believed back then that witches had rebuffed the sacrament of Christ, meaning that baptism was definitely a no-go for a witch. Because water is tied heavily to baptism, the logic followed that if you were a witch and you were thrown into the water, then the water would reject your body from entering and therefore you would float to the top of it. To test this theory, they would take their suspected witches, strip them down naked, hog tie their limbs, and then throw you into the water, and if you floated, then you're a witch, but if you sank, you're just a person. Again guys, this kind of makes sense, except for the people who weren't actually witches and sank to the bottom. Now I should note that they would sometimes tie a rope around your body, and if you sank, they would pull you back up to the top. But this only happened sometimes. Other times they would just throw you in, and if you sank and drowned, then oh well, I mean, you drowned now and at least you weren't a witch. Also, this tying of the rope wasn't a perfect science either. A lot of times people who sank would drown anyways as they were being pulled up. Basically, just the accusation of being a witch meant that you would be sentenced to death, because if you did somehow manage to float, then now you're a witch and you're gonna be burned or hung, and if you did sink, as most people did, then you'd probably just drown. Sometimes even if you did sink and you did then get pulled back up to the top and survived, they would just kill you anyways. Back then, if more than one person accused you of being a witch, then you were pretty much as good as dead.
Kicking off our list today, we have Guide Spademanger, one of the first women executed for sorcery in Denmark and in Scandinavia. In 1543, King Christian III of Denmark equipped a fleet of 40 ships to chase away an imperial Dutch fleet from the coast of Norway to the Netherlands. Outside of Helsinki, his fleet was stuck in a calm, and the whole project failed. Soon, a merchant's wife named Guide Spademanger was arrested and tortured, believed to have gathered a group of witches in a valley outside the city and enchanted the ships. She eventually admitted to conducting a spell with a coven on a hill above Elsinore, and named several more people that were involved, male and female, including vicars, which led to the expansion of the witch trial. Her trial was handled by the royal governor Giselle. She also said that the enchantments would never disappear unless Guide herself was allowed to remove them personally. The people that she named were arrested and tortured to an extent quoted as so hard their limbs were separated, but none other than Guide confessed. In November of 1543, the king demanded for the rightful old principle of witches to be burned, but she sadly suffered through further interrogations first before meeting the end of her time. In fourth place, we have Agnes Samson. Starting off this tale, when King James decided to marry Anne, Princess of Denmark, as quickly as he possibly could, this wedding was arranged in Denmark with a proxy standing in for him since he was, located in Scotland. Anne's attempts to join her new husband across the ocean were severely delayed by dangerous and life-threatening storms, so he eventually decided to join her instead. After another wedding ceremony, which the king actually attended, the couple decided to head home to Scotland, with yet another storm plaguing their journey. Witchcraft trials had already begun in Denmark. Remember Guide? I mentioned a minute ago? And the king had taken note. So when it was reported to him that witches East Lothian conspired to cause the treacherous weather that threatened not just his life, but that of his way too young bride, he believed what he was told. Agnes Samson was an elderly woman who was known locally as a healer and a midwife, having cared for and successfully cured many neighbors of ailments throughout her life. She was a widow with several children, living close to poverty in East Lothian. She had been suspected and investigated for witchcraft before, so there was no surprise locally that her name was given. After she was named, Agnes was quickly captured and protested her innocence. The News from Scotland, which was an English-written pamphlet that would have been written in London around 1591, says that Agnes was shaved from head to toe and each part of her body tortured for hours, intentionally to cause intense pain. The devil's mark was found, and she confessed, saying that she and hundreds of other witches attended North Berwick Kirk on Halloween night to meet with the devil to end the life of the king. She claimed the devil appeared to her as a black man, a dog, or a hayrick. Agnes also mentioned various attempts to obtain the king's shirt or other personal linens in order to work her charms. She had attended a witches' convent at North Berwick with her son-in-law, where they collected bones and powdered them for Sid charms. To prove her magical powers, she told the king the exact words that had passed between him and his new wife on their wedding night. Agnes's trial was presided over by a judge, with a jury of 17 men from East Lothian, many of whom would have known Agnes personally. After hearing the evidence, they found her guilty of 49 out of the 51 charges. In January of 1591, she was taken to Edinburgh Castle and met her end by way of a rope necklace, with her body then being burned at the stake. The naked ghost of a bald Agnes is said to roam the palace of Holyrood House, the official Scottish residence of the British monarchy. Let me know in the comments if you've ever been or if you've seen Agnes yourself. In third place, we have a ducking chair, not to be confused with a cucking chair, which is a whole other concept, or the red hot stools women accused of having sexual acts with the devil would have to sit on. I sadly don't have enough information to unpack that stool, other than ouch! But let's get on with the ducking, shall we? The ducking stool was a strongly made wooden armchair, often made out of oak, in which the offender was seated, with an iron band being placed around them so that they would not fall out during their immersion. How thorough. The earliest record of the use of such is towards the beginning of the 17th century, with the term first being attested in English in 1597. It was used both in Europe and in the English colonies of North America. Usually the chair was fastened to a long wooden beam fixed as like a seesaw on the edge of a pond or river. And as much as I love and miss wooden playgrounds, I feel like this might not have been as fun. Sometimes the ducking stool was not a fixture, but was mounted on a pair of wooden wheels so that it could be wheeled through the streets, and at the river edge was hung by a chain from the end of a beam. In sentencing a woman, the magistrates ordered the number of duckings she should have, and as much as I've scoured the internet, I can't seem to find number data on this. If you have any ideas, please let me know in the comments. Another type of ducking stool was called a tumbrel, and was a chair on two wheels with two long shafts fixed to the axles. This was pushed into the pond, and then the shafts would be released, ergo tipping the chair up backwards. Sometimes the punishment proved fatal and the subject died. Once again, the sometimes should be taken with a pound of salt. In medieval times until the early 18th century, ducking was a way used to establish whether a suspect was a witch. The ducking stools were first used for this purpose, but ducking was later inflicted without the chair. In this instance, the subject's right thumb was bound to her left big toe, her left thumb to her right big toe, a rope was tied around the waist of the accused, and she was thrown into a river or a deep pond. If she floated, it was deemed that she was in league with the devil, rejecting the baptismal water. If she sank, she was cleared. Oh, and she'd be dead. Can't forget that part. Silly me. In second place, Perna Hosman was a midwife, born sometime between 1510 to 1527, where she lived and worked in Bavaria. Her trial was one of the most ruthless witch trials in Germany. Perna's life had been unremarkable until her arrest on charges of witchcraft, sorcery, and vampirism in the year 1587. After her arrest, she was subjected to terrible torture. Go figure, until she confessed to her deeds. According to her confession, soon after she became widowed in 1556, when she was working in the field of the city, she had made arrangements to meet a male co-worker for sex in her cottage later that evening. But he had not arrived. Instead, a demon had come dressed in his clothes. She established a relationship with said demon, named Federlin, who made her swear allegiance to the devil and promised to rid her of poverty. Hey, sounds pretty tempting. During her confession, she stated that she had sworn herself to Satan and written it on a contract, and Federlin had then taken her to the real devil and confirmed her contract, after which they had drunk wine, consumed the roasted flesh of young humans, and had sex. And in case I need to clarify, she had intercourse with Federlin, not the devil. Plot twist, I know. She described visiting the devil often, and her demon lover had also visited her plenty to have sex with her, even in the streets at night and while she was in prison, leaving every time she said the name of Jesus. Alright, well, that's one way to come down from it. Federlin had gifted her the magical ointment she used to harm her victims, which included humans of a variety of ages, animals, and even crops. She confessed to having ended the life of many young during her work as a midwife by applying the special salve or putting pressure to their foreheads and to have sucked their blood like a vampire. Perna also confessed to having eaten the young with other witches and using their hair for sorcery. The full list of crimes she confessed to was very long, with her victims including 41 young humans, 2 mothers in labor, and a multitude of other people and animals, including cows, pigs, geese, and a horse. The decision of authorities was swift and unanimous, with the church and royal court finding her guilty and sentencing her to death. Before being burned, she was first taken through the city and stopped 5 times before reaching the place of execution. At the first stop, they branded her left breast and right arm with irons, then her right breast at the second stop, her left arm at the third, with her left hand being then branded at the 4th stop. Once they reached the place of execution, her right hand, with which she had made her oath as a midwife, was cut off before finally being burned alive at the stake. Her ashes were not allowed to remain on soil, but were then dumped in a stream. In first place, we have Gilles Garnier. I swear I don't intentionally plan to name male witches as the worst on my list, but they tend to commit the most heinous acts throughout history. And before anyone wants to try to correct me in the comments again, men have often been named as witches throughout time. Continuing on, Gilles Garnier was a reclusive loner living in the woods around Dole, France. Despite being a solitary man, he got married in 1572. Historians have reported that Gilles was ill-equipped to provide for his family because he wasn't a very good hunter, being used to only having to provide for himself until that point. That's when he started hunting something else. Hey, anyone out there want to guess? Come on, I bet you can. Alright, I'll give it to you. Human flesh. The first hunt happened around September 29th of 1572 when Garnier killed a young woman, allegedly well in the form of a wolf, and brought some of the flesh home for his wife to eat. How, thoughtful? Throughout the autumn, more young humans were found unalived and mutilated, including another young woman that Giles bit and clawed at, but was interrupted by passerbys before fleeing. The girl sadly succumbed to her injuries a few days later. In November, Gilles ended the life of a young man this time, enjoying the flesh from his thighs and belly before tearing off a leg to save for later. I could name more, but I'm feeling a little queasy as it is. This caused a stir amongst the townspeople, who believed it was a werewolf who was committing the horrors. Many folks had witnessed a humanoid-looking wolf near the scenes of the crimes, with the animal darting off once it was aware of being seen. Then in January of 1573, there was one last death. This time, villagers heard a child screaming and the sounds of a wolf, witnessing the wolf attempt to flee the scene, but changing into the form of Gilles as it did. He was then arrested, put on the rack, and confessed to killing the young and consuming their flesh. At his trial, more than 50 people testified, and he was found guilty of lycanthropy, the ability to turn into an animal, and witchcraft. He and his wife were burned at the stake on January 8, 1573. And now that my lunch is threatening to make another appearance, number 5, did rye bread cause the witch hunts? According to my research, this is apparently the most common bizarre myth in all of Salem. So ergot is a fungus blight that forms hallucinogenic, fun stuff in bread, causing its victims to appear bewitched when actually they're just higher than a kite. The victims of ergot might suffer paranoia and hallucinations, twitches and spasms, cardiovascular trouble, and stillborn stuff. This particular fungus thrives in a cold winter followed by a wet spring and seriously weakens the immune system. Human poisoning due to the consumption of rye bread made from ergot-infected grain was actually pretty common in Europe back in the Dark Ages. The first mention of a plague of gangrenous ergotism in Europe comes from Germany back in 857, and following this, France and Scandinavia experienced similar outbreaks. England is notably absent from the historical regions affected by ergotism since its main source of food was wheat, which is resistant to ergot fungi. Back in 944, a massive outbreak of ergotism caused 40,000 deaths in the regions of Aquitaine, Limousin, Périgord, and Angoumois in France. The theory of ergot poisoning is that it grew on the rye that the colonists of Salem used to make their bread. The ergot would have had that LSD-like effect that caused the inhabitants to see and hear things that weren't there, thus causing the bizarre hallucinations, which caused over 250 people to be accused of witchcraft. The origins of this legend started in 1976 when Linda R. Caporio wrote a paper entitled Ergotism, the Satan Loosed in Salem? It was publicly dismissed by Stephen Nissenbaum, a historian and co-author of Salem Possessed, and over the years dozens of experts have weighed in and found the basis for this theory lacking in anything resembling convincing. For starters, at the time the custom was for all bread to be served toasted, as Puritans generally believed that untoasted bread caused stomach problems, which would have helped to kill off any ergot that survived baking. Also, one of the most common side effects besides hallucinations was gangrene and necrotism of the extremities. If this was happening during a time when every single instance of perceived witchcraft was being documented, and dozens of people were so affected by this, ergot poisoning that they were having hallucinations, someone would have documented that, the other symptoms were happening as well. And to my knowledge, the other symptoms weren't as common. Number 4, the ghost of Sheriff George Corwin. So while I've done my best to try and leave the witches themselves off of today's list, since I did promise y'all legends that weren't the trials, you might have picked up by now that most of the legends revolve around the history of the trials in one way or another. There's no escaping it, so make sure you're still buckled up and enjoy. Sheriff Corwin was the most infamous and brutal when it came to interrogating and handling accused witches back in the day, earning himself a nickname for his heinous methods of torment. Oh, you want to know what the nickname was? Well, sadly, I'm not allowed to say it thanks to interweb rules, but it involved hands around necks and lack of air. A building called the Joshua Ward House now stands on top of the land where George lived and died, and many people say that they've seen him in the windows or even felt his hands pressing down around their necks when they're inside the space. In terms of lineage, he was the nephew of witchcraft trials judge and witch house owner Jonathan Corwin. He's most famously known for the case of Giles Corey, who endured peine forte et dure, or a pressing of stones upon his chest for 3 days, while Sheriff Corwin repeatedly asked him to enter an official plea before his God and country, which Corey had refused to do so in court. According to the legend, George was so sadistic and enjoyed tormenting folks so much that he had a secret dungeon below his home, where he could carry out his fiendish desires whenever he wished. Now that we have the legend part of this out of the way, time to consult the history books for the factual side of things. The actual cases of George tormenting the accused are documented, but are far fewer than have actually been attributed to him. In the case of Giles Corey, who had pleaded innocent but refused to use the official phrasing, likely to delay proceedings and cause trouble for the court and judges that he was furious with, his punishment was technically illegal by the original Massachusetts law. The Body of Liberties Act of 1641 forbade extreme harm, and while the Body of Liberties was officially replaced by the Provincial Charter in 1691, aka the year the witchcraft hysteria began, it was still very much upheld in spirit during this time, and George performing these acts was not seen as appropriate. It may have even led to Governor Phipps, paying more attention to the trials and to disband the court of Oyer and Terminer that he himself had set up. Also, if he had actually had his own personal dungeon for illegal bad things, there would have had to have been multiple cover-ups, and there isn't really proof of that during a time when everything was documented. At the end of the day, there isn't proof he did, or didn't, so let me know in the comments where you stand on this. In the middle of this scary sandwich, we have Aude de la Barthe in third place. Born around 1230 in Toulouse, France, she was a noblewoman and a Gnostic Christian, which was a sect that was considered heretical by the Catholic Church. By definition, Gnostic Christian is a term that refers to various branches of early Christianity that claim to have special divine knowledge. They have different views of the Bible, Jesus Christ, salvation, and God compared to traditional Catholics. They have diverse teachings and practices such as Valentinianism, Sethianism, Manichaeism, and Mandaism. Some of them regard Jesus as a human being who became enlightened or Christed, while others see him as a divine being who came to lead humanity back to the light. In 1275, Aude was accused of having sexual relations with Satan, and she was impregnated by him, giving birth to a baby that had the head of a wolf and a serpent's tail. This being consumed human flesh, and Aude stole infants to feed it. When she was arrested, she was tortured, eventually confessed that the accusations were true. She was sentenced to death and burned alive, making her the first in Europe to have her life ended from accusations of witchcraft. Also, fun fact for you, at the time it wasn't illegal to have sexual relations with demons. If you have access to a time machine out there, don't get any ideas. Number 2, the bodies under the witch house. So remember when I mentioned Jonathan Corwin just a few moments ago? Yeah, that's about to come into play again. So when the Corwin house, aka Jonathan's house, was moved back in the 1940s to accommodate the widening of the street, underneath the original hearth were several bones. These were thought to be hidden bodies, and the town was in an uproar over the hidden corpses in the basement of the witch house. And if we're going off of information based on the legend, it would make sense with the whole secret dungeon of George's. This legend actually has the most historical fact behind it, as there was indeed a newspaper article about bones found under the witch house, along with a shocking headline and gruesome photo to accompany it. Sadly, or well, I guess not sadly for humans, just sadly for the purpose of sensationalism, the reality behind that headline is a little more mundane. It was common at the time of building said house, around the 1640s, to bury meat or bones underneath the cooking hearth in order to promote plentiful food for its inhabitants. Even if this wasn't the case, since I know we all like to poke holes into thin theories, the odds of charred bones from various meals over the past 300 years finding their way into the ashes and under added bricks isn't really unlikely. And regardless of their origin, the bones discovered were decidedly not human. Apparently a whole boatload of tests were done. So sadly, unlike the Disney urban legend where we found out that there really are human boats on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, this one might be bunk. As a side note to this entry, there are no official cases of witchcraft trial victims being brought to the Corwin house for examination. While Corwin may have heard original accusations in his parlor, the odds of him being willing to bring an accused witch into his home, with his family and descendants, are astronomically against it. Dang it all though, I like when my theories are right. Number 1, the Seven Gables Secret Stairs. The House of the Seven Gables, which is also known as the Turner House or Turner Ingersoll Mansion, is a 1668 colonial mansion in Salem, Massachusetts, named for its gables. It was made famous by Nathaniel Hawthorne's 1851 novel, The House of the Seven Gables, and is now a non-profit museum. The earliest section of the House of the Seven Gables was built in 1668 for Captain John Turner and remained in his family for 3 generations, descending from John Turner II to John Turner III. you get the idea. Facing south towards Salem Harbor, it was originally a 2-room, 2.5-story house with a projecting front porch and a massive central chimney, but nowadays that portion forms the middle of the house. 4 windows of the original ground room floor, which became a dining room, remain in the house's side wall, and a few years after the original build, a kitchen lean-to and a new north kitchen L to the rear of the house were added. By 1676, Captain Turner had added a spacious front extension with its own chimney, containing a parlor on the ground floor with a large bedchamber above it. Ceilings in this new wing are higher than the very low ceilings in older parts of the house, and it featured double basement windows and an overhang with carved pendants. It was all capped with a 3-gabled garret. In the first half of the 18th century, John Turner II remodeled the house in the New Georgian style, adding wood paneling and sash windows. These alterations are preserved as very early examples of Georgian decor. The House of the Seven Gables is one of the oldest surviving timber-framed mansion houses in continental North America, with 17 rooms and over 8,000 square feet, including its large cellars. So for as long as people have been giving and taking tours of the House of the Seven Gables, the story has gone that the secret staircase of the house was used for just about everything, from smuggling freed slaves through the Underground Railroad to hiding secret lovers for midnight trysts. Sadly, it's just a set of servant stairs. So back when servants were in common usage, these stairs and passages were just as common, since it was considered unseemly for the servants to be in public view. They were meant to be invisible, spiriting into rooms to make them tidy without anybody noticing them. Ergo, hidden stairs and passageways were built to make it easy for them to access areas without meeting the gentry in the main halls and stairs. They're pretty common in older grand places. Locations like Casa Loma jump to mind for me, since they have one behind like a fireplace or something, if my memory's correct. Apparently in recent years there has been some debate over whether the staircase would have been part of the original or later period structure, as it was part of a rebuild by a famous colonial revivalist architect by the name of Joseph Chandler at the direction of Caroline Emerton in 1909. It absolutely fits with the design of servant stairs though, that are seen in many similar structures. And gosh dang, here I was hoping for another home on the same level of spooky as the Winchester Mystery House over in California. Now that's a home with the most random additions with no meaning, all meant to hopefully appease spirits. Funny enough, I think an acquaintance of mine is working there as a scare actor this year. It's a good reminder to touch base with them. And that brings us to the end of our time, and yep, I really need to get around to visiting Salem sooner rather than later. There's just so much incredible history that I need to see with my own eyes. If you enjoyed my ramblings today, could you help us out by giving this video a like, subscribing if you aren't already, hit the bell for more unsettling content from us here at Top 5 Scary Videos, and I'll see y'all next time, you lovely spooky people.